Welcome back. It's me, your favorite neighborhood podcaster, and I'm here to ruin every Marvel movie for you in 1 hour. I promise that I'm joking here. I'm actually not trying to spoil your fun. I don't want to rain on anybody's parade. I go to Marvel movies just like every other guy. Like every other person in America, I shill out my $20 or whatever and sit in the IMAX theater and I watch like Spider-Man, the third Spider-Man 3, Spider-Man Cubed, or whatever. And so I do not want to like disparage anybody for doing that or say that you shouldn't go do it. I don't know. It seems fine. But I also think that as cultural products, as one of our most successful cultural ventures, this massive, successful work of pop art, I think that the Marvel Cinematic Universe deserves attention and critique. I think fair is fair. If you're going to make stories that grab, an entire nation and the entire world, then we should take them seriously and ask what kind of ideas they're acting out. And so one of the things that I want to focus on in this episode is this concept of the multiverse. This is a podcast about the history of Western culture and philosophy, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe has basically placed in front of millions of people this ancient idea that there are what the Greeks would have called many worlds, many cosmoi or cosmoses. The idea that where we live, the space that we operate and move through, is just one universe operating according to certain rules, and there are perhaps infinitely many others where different rules apply. And not only is this being resurrected on screen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it has also received this sort of new life in the field of physics. So scientists are actually engaged in highly technical debates about whether we really do live in a multiverse and how we could ever possibly know. But let me just read to you from the maybe most direct pop expression of this idea, which is from the introduction of Marvel's What If. This is on Netflix. It's an animated series, and each episode is basically an alternate version of some movie or story that they've already put out on the big screen. So you get like Captain America, but what if it was actually Captain America's girlfriend who got the powers, or whatever? What if Doctor Strange sort of became evil and tried to go back in time and rescue his girlfriend, all this stuff. Here's the introduction to that show. It's very short. Time. Space, reality. It's more than a linear path. It's a prism of endless possibility where a single choice can branch out into infinite realities, creating alternate worlds from the ones you know. I am the watcher. I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if? That's the clearest, most direct possible statement of it, but basically every Marvel property, with some small exceptions, every major Marvel property since Avengers Endgame, when they brought the whole big conflict to its ostensible conclusion, every Marvel property since then has in some way been founded on this idea that there are multiple dimensions or multiple universes in which some of the things that happened in the old movies either didn't happen or are being revised, or maybe they were only happening in one corner and there was other stuff happening in this much larger scale. Spider-Man, I call it Spider-Man Cubed, but the latest Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse or whatever, with all three Spider-Men, Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland. Loki is another big one, and of course, What If, all operate according to this principle of the multiverse. Now, I am not a scientist, so I am going to try to explain the science of the multiverse to you in some brief and outline, sketchy kind of terms, and hopefully that will be accurate. But what I'm really going to argue is that the multiverse is not a scientific idea because it's inherently unverifiable. If there are other universes, they don't have any impact upon ours, and so there's no way to empirically verify. According to our empiria, which is that Greek word of experience, right? There's no way to get empirical verification of the multiverse. So what it really is a philosophical and indeed a quasi-theological idea. So I'm going to critique it on that level as an idea that has existed throughout thousands of years of history and that has certain consequences both in philosophy and in art. Let's get started. If you want to learn Latin, Greek, or Biblical Hebrew, and you should, you got to check out the Ancient Language Institute. They are the best place to go to learn these ancient languages, which is one of the most enriching and fulfilling things you could possibly do, especially when it comes to the texts we talk about on this show. ALI is great because they will get you reading those texts as quickly as possible. You will not have to jump through a million hoops or memorize these enormous, grammatical or vocabulary lists before you start reading the Bible, the Athenian philosophers, the golden age of Latin poetry. All there. They're great at teaching it, and you don't have to be an expert. They take every level of student. So go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics. That's ancientlanguage.com/heretics and get a 10% discount on tuition with the promo code heretics. This is great bang for your buck. I've been working with these guys really since the beginning of the show. I trust them implicitly. And this is really something valuable that you should be checking out. Go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics and get a 10% discount on your tuition with the promo code heretics. It will change your life to learn one of these languages. And there's no better place to go than the Ancient Language Institute to do it. Go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics and get 10% off with the promo code heretics. So like I said, the modern multiverse alone has many, many different variations and forms. There's a very old one from the 50s. Schrödinger, the famous quantum physicist, proposed this idea that, in fact, when two possible events or outcomes can occur, they both happen in separate multiverses, or separate universes, rather. This kind of many worlds idea of quantum outcomes. But the one that most sort of grabs the imagination right now is this one in which the different multiverses have different fundamental laws, and most importantly, they have different beginnings, sort of configurations of mass and energy at the beginning. And the reason that this has become such a live issue is because the more we learn about the physics of our universe, the more the facts on the ground exhibit what scientists have started to call fine-tuning. Both the configuration of mass and energy at the beginning of the universe and the laws and constants that govern the kind of fundamental motions of space and time are minutely calibrated so that life as we know it can exist. And there are something like, we're never quite sure exactly how many of these fine-tuning constants there are, because we may always discover more. But there are at least 12 that exhibit remarkable fine-tuning, and there are others that, may or may not. One example of this, just one example, is the strong force, right, which is the force that holds elementary particles together, holds quarks together. If it were 2% different, that is, if the constant which governs it were 2% different, we wouldn't be able to have life on Earth as we know it. And there's just an enormous array of these. And so the question arises, if there's no logical reason why these constants, these laws have to be this way, how can it be that they just so happen to be perfectly calibrated, perfectly tuned, that conscious life exists on Earth? And the multiverse has become popular and gained its currency as an answer to that idea. And so there are all these different ways of trying to explain how it might be that there would be all these different multiverses. You need, remember, to solve two problems. You need to solve the problem of the configuration of mass and energy at the beginning of the universe, that what some people have called or postulated as the Big Bang. You need to solve how that can have been so specific. And you need to solve the laws and constants problem. And the multiverse idea is basically, well, if those figures, those numbers, are just infinitely different in infinitely different multiverses, or infinitely many different universes, rather, within a giant multiverse, if they're infinitely different, then eventually you're going to come up with the universe that is like ours, that has all these conditions to support life. It's like monkeys on a typewriter, right? Monkeys, you need infinitely many monkeys at infinitely many typewriters. Will one of them eventually produce Shakespeare's Hamlet? Well, if they just generate, all the possible variations, then yes. And so, leaving aside the very many other theories that exist to support this idea of the multiverse, I'm going to focus on the one that's most popular, most promising for answering these questions. And that is called the inflationary string landscape model. So again, I'm not a scientist. If you want to get a deep grasp on this stuff, you should go read Stephen Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. He's a very good sort of popular explainer of scientific ideas. And I'm going to quote him in a second, but I am just going to give this outline of how this is supposed to work, right? You have multiple what's called vacua, which are basically little configurations of strings that create the laws of the universe. And as each of those little universes expand, they expand infinitely, but they kind of collapse. Their expansion collapses or stops, and the vacua themselves break apart and have a kind of a decay that causes them to reconfigure, and you get what's called bubble universes. So imagine a balloon blowing up, right? But some little part of it stops blowing up, and then it kind of funnels off into this other universe, and then multiple other universes can come out of that. And the expansion part of it gives you multiple different mass energy configurations at the beginning, and the string theory part of it, the multiple vacua, gives you different laws and constants. And so that combination of things, those two ideas, would give you basically just a random universe generator that would eventually, given an infinite amount of time, come up with a universe like ours. I'm going to read to you from Meyer's summary now of the things that you have to believe in order to accept this. And let me now, again, stress that this is a way of getting out of God, right? This is a way of getting out of having to believe that the fine-tuning of the universe is the result simply of a transcendent mind which conditions the universe to create life as its purpose. Hey, I want to say thank you to everybody that headed to the merch store for our holiday sales. We had a sale all throughout Christmas and New Year's, and I saw a bunch of you tweeting selfies with your new gear. It looks great. Really appreciate you checking that out, and I hope you like the stuff. It looks like you do. There's all sorts of great stuff still available. It's all still there at good prices at youngheretics.com/shop. Hats, stickers, shirts, the works, and all top quality stuff that we've tested ourselves. Go check it out, youngheretics.com/shop. Here's what Meyer says. He says, in theory at least, the inflationary string landscape model can explain the whole range of fine-tuning phenomena, but only at the cost of what philosophers of science call a bloated ontology. Ontology, just to make a note here, right? Ontology is the science of what is, or the philosophy of what is, what exists. That is, it does so by positing an extraordinary number of purely hypothetical abstract entities for which we have no direct evidence. Indeed, to explain the fine-tuning of both the initial conditions and the laws and constants of physics, the combination of inflationary cosmology and string theory needs to affirm numerous purely hypothetical entities, abstract postulates, and unobservable processes. That's that empiria, that lack of empirical verification I was talking about, right? In particular, for an inflationary string landscape model to explain both types of fine-tuning, it must make the following postulations. 1, an inflation field exists, right? This field of inflation that causes the universe essentially to expand. 2, the decay of inflation fields will produce new bubble universes with different initial conditions. 3, the process of inflation will continue eternally into the future. 4, an infinite number of bubble universes exists or will eventually exist. 5, unimaginably small vibrating strings of energy exist. This is the string theory part of it, right? 6 or 7, this is item 6, 6 or 7 extra hidden spatial dimensions exist. 7, the vibrating strings of energy within string vacua create the physical phenomena we observe. These are sort of fundamentals of string theory generally. 8, lines of flux around the compactification of space exists, making them quasi-stable with a positive cosmological constant. 9, supersymmetry applies to fundamental springs so that both gravitons and gravitinos exist, and their different vibrational modes correspond to all forms of radiation, matter, and the fundamental forces of physics. 10, every mathematical solution to the equations of string theory corresponds to an actually existing universe with different laws and constants of physics, i.e., the string landscape exists. So he's saying these are the things that you have to accept as given. String theory already, before the multiverse became quite such a popular idea, string theory already had this problem that its equations produced many different possible solutions. And one way of coming up with an answer to that is to say, well, all of those solutions are solved in some universe. Essentially, you solve for all those solutions and you get this full array of, not infinitely many, but enormously many universes. What Meyer is pointing out is that many of these postulates are at least theoretical in the sense of, they exist in mathematical solutions. You can solve for them mathematically, but we have no proof of them because inherently we can't have proof of other universes. They exist beyond our experience. And what this means is that in order to accept this concept, you have to accept a number of ideas for which there is no proof. That is to say, first principle ideas or philosophical ideas. Remember a while ago, I was talking about the fact that because some scientists have come to believe that there is only matter, that they've come to be materialists, they therefore believe that their science, which is the science of studying matter, that science explains everything, answers all questions. And so this is the outcome of that belief. The idea that science can answer all questions leads science to start answering questions that it was never designed to answer. Science exists to answer the question, how does matter behave, and according to what laws, right? Physical science, natural philosophy, as the ancients would have called it. But if that's the only thing that there is, then you also have to start asking and answering these questions of why. Where does this universe come from? Why is it the way that it is? And once you're asking those questions, you're actually not asking scientific questions. You're asking philosophical and theological questions. And so it is natural that science in a materialistic age has morphed into philosophy and theology. This is also why it's natural that people have come to worship Dr. Fauci and to look at him not just as a doctor with such and such degrees of competence, but also as the philosopher who can answer all questions of right and wrong, what should be done, what should not be done. People now make prayer candles with Fauci on them, right? He's taken up this role of cleric and priest because science has taken up the role of explainer of everything. And naturally, because human beings have curiosity about things that are more than matter, that means that scientists are starting to answer these questions about what's the universe, where does it come from, but they refuse to answer it by suggesting the possibility that there might be a God. So that's where the multiverse, or the popularity of the multiverse, comes from, this incredibly complex idea of multiple string universes bubbling outward and expanding infinitely, so that you can get away from acknowledging that our universe is particularly fine-tuned to support life. Here's an article in the New York Times by Paul Davies, in which he describes this idea and asks what kind of idea it is. So I'm going to read to you now his sort of summary of what I've just been saying. Davies writes, "For a start, how is the existence of other universes to be tested? To be sure, all cosmologists accept that there are some regions of the universe that lie beyond the reach of our telescopes. But somewhere on the slippery slope between that and the idea that there is an infinite number of universes, credibility reaches a limit. As one slips down that slope, more and more must be accepted on faith, and less is open to scientific verification. Extreme multiverse explanations are therefore reminiscent of theological discussions. Indeed, invoking an infinity of unseen universes to explain the unusual features of one we do see is just as ad hoc as invoking an unseen creator. The multiverse theory may be dressed up in scientific language, but in essence, it requires the same leap of faith." Davies is exactly right in the sense that in order to believe in the multiverse, you have to make certain leaps of faith. You have to posit certain theological ideas, or at least cosmological ideas, that have no basis in verification or empirical science. And what's really interesting is that there is now a movement in the philosophy of science to accept that as science, to accept science that has no empirical basis. If you want to learn more about this, you read George Ellis and Joe Silk, who wrote in Nature a while back, for these arguments that they say the veracity of string theory can be established through philosophical and probabilistic arguments about the research process. In other words, we should scrap the empirical requirement of science and let scientists opine, or indeed declare, on questions of theological and metaphysical nature. Here's my answer to this. I am not a scientist, as I have said before. And that means that I am not going to be the person who goes out and does the mathematical calculation or seeks the empirical evidence that could confirm or deny the possibility of multiple universes. I'm not even opposed to it in principle exactly. But I do think, right, that if it is the case that what we're doing is just suggesting a cosmology, that is inventing a philosophy in order to avoid God, then I am just as qualified as anybody else to comment on philosophy and metaphysics. I'm not qualified as a scientist, but I am actually a student of philosophy and of the philosophy of both the ancient world and increasingly of the modern world. And so, anybody that studies these ideas, that asks theological questions, is competent to engage with scientists about this idea of the multiverse or the idea of an intelligent creator. It's not some special authority that scientists have to declare questions of why and how and wherefore, right? Their job is to study matter and to tell you how matter works. They have expertise in that domain. I'm not challenging that at all. What I am challenging is that expertise translates into authority to proclaim on the ultimate cause of the universe or to invent any number of, cosmological, metaphysical ideas that I can just as easily invent. And indeed, when I invent them, I'm drawing on thousands of years of theology and philosophy. So I'm going to take the multiverse up on those grounds, on those terms. I'm going to talk about it as a philosophical, theological idea, because that's what it is. I'm going to examine its history in that respect. And finally, I'm going to show why, as an idea, the multiverse is fundamentally nihilist and produces bad art, which is why the Marvel Cinematic Universe now sucks. All right, let's get into it. All right, folks, now is the time to sign up for the Magnus Fellowship at the Albertus Magnus Institute. My friends over there are running what, in my opinion, is one of the best solutions to our broken higher education system. If you care at all about the true, the good, and the beautiful, and you want to know how to take your education further, there is no better way than the Magnus Fellowship. And now is the time to join for the spring 2022 term. It starts on February 7th, and they're going to be teaching courses in all sorts of awesome stuff, including the epic literature of The Lord of the Rings and Kristin Lavransdatter. One of those you will almost certainly have heard of. One of them you may not have, but they are both phenomenal works of literature. You'll also learn about philosophy of human nature, the philosophy of being, all sorts of stuff that we talk and care about on this show. You can take it deeper with the Magnus Fellowship when you go to magnusinstitute.org. All the courses in the fellowship are live, online, interactive, and free, but there are only 25 spots in this spring fellowship. So go sign up. They'll fill up quickly. Discover why the Magnus Fellowship is the fastest growing liberal arts learning community in the world. magnusinstitute.org/heretics. One more time, magnusinstitute.org/heretics. You got to go to that link with /heretics to get a free gift when you sign up for the fellowship, magnusinstitute.org/heretics. Check it out. So, okay, in order to get into the history of this idea of many worlds, which is how the ancients referred to this notion that there were places kind of out there beyond our perception where different rules apply, right? In order to get into this idea, we have to go back to our old buddy Epicurus. If you've been with me for a while, you know that we did a series of episodes on the Hellenistic philosophers. That is the schools of philosophy that emerged kind of after the heyday of Athens and after the death of Alexander the Great. You had the Stoics, you had the Epicureans, you had a number of other kinds of philosophy, kinds of ways of looking at the world. And I said when I discussed those kinds of philosophy that there is a funny way in which we are all Epicureans now. That is, Epicurus is the philosopher who looked at the world in the way that is closest to the way we now instinctively look at the world, even if we know better. There's this kind of atmospheric philosophy that just, happens in the air. People just assume that it's true, even if when they think about it, it doesn't really work. And Epicureanism, which is not the, mere pursuit of physical pleasure, which is sometimes accused of that. It's not that. It's not just being a gourmand. But it is a fundamentally materialist philosophy. That is, it posits that in the world there are atoms and there is a void through which they move, and they bounce off each other and they move around according to certain predictable laws, and that's it. That's what we know about. That's all we can talk about. The gods exist, but they're on a plane of existence that is totally beyond our perception, and also they don't interfere in human affairs. So our human life can be totally understood in terms of atoms bouncing off of one another. What's funny about this is it's basically what materialists now believe, that atoms, or at least the behavior of fundamental particles and the laws according to which they interact, explains everything. It's an exhaustive explanation of human life. It's a complete ontology, as it were. I'm going to read to you a letter from John Adams, our buddy, the founding father, to John Rogers from 1801. This was pointed out to me by my friend Richard Samuelson, who's a scholar of Adams. And Adams basically complains about exactly what I'm saying, that in, kind of Enlightenment and just after the Enlightenment era, we've basically all become Epicurean materialists. He writes, "We in this age are more unfortunate in one respect than the ancient Gentiles. Among them, the philosophers were divided into numerous sects, the followers of Socrates, of Plato, of Pythagoras, and Zeno, as well as of Epicurus. All the former had a mixture of good morals, manly virtues, and true opinions among their errors, and all of them served to counterpoise and counteract the poisonous, pestilential, and most fatal doctrine of Epicurus. The Portico, for example, that's the Stoa. Stoics produced men like the Catos, Cicero, Seneca, Brutus, Epictetus, and others who were saints in comparison of Caesar and Antony. But our modern philosophers are all the low, groveling disciples of Epicurus, not one Stoic and no Platonician among them. Where then are we going? Are we all to become epicuri egregae porci? This is like pigs from the field, from the herd of Epicurus. There is one thing, my dear doctor, which has given me much uneasiness. How can it have happened that such great numbers of our good friends, the Presbyterians, have become the advocates, disciples, and voters, if not votaries, of the great doctors of Epicurean philosophy? But I have written a tedious letter when I intended only to have acknowledged your favor. I love that conclusion because it's typical John Adams, this curmudgeon going off on this long rant about Epicureanism when I just meant to acknowledge your favor. I wonder if this is kind of a subtweet, kind of a pot shot at Jefferson. That famously, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had this tumultuous friendship. They were kind of frenemies for a long time. And Jefferson himself declared in one of his letters, I too am an Epicurean. I don't think Jefferson understood Epicurus very well. But I wonder if Adams is referring to that, and he's certainly referring to this materialism, which was becoming popular again in the wake of, in many cases, specifically the Scottish Enlightenment, but Enlightenment philosophy generally. We're going to get to that, but let's remind ourselves first about Epicurus, specifically Epicurus' idea of multiple worlds, right? We are all Epicureans now. Why does his materialism result in multiple worlds? Well, he's reaching back even further in the history of philosophy to these guys Democritus and Leucippus, who were also what's called atomists, right? They believed in this kind of materialist world of atoms bouncing off of one another. And they too thought there must be multiple cosmoi, multiple universes, multiple worlds. So I'm going to read to you from our old friend Diogenes Laertius, who compiles many of the materials from these different schools of philosophy. He's particularly interested, it seems, in Epicureanism, and he records lengthy letters that Epicurus wrote to some of his students. So here's a passage, just a short passage from one of them, and then we'll read a little bit more Epicureanism after that. This is, for those of you that are following along at home, this is Pamela Mensch's wonderful translation of the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. It's Book 10, Chapter 45. Furthermore, there is an unlimited number of worlds, some of them like ours, others unlike. For the atoms, being unlimited in number, as has just been shown, travel to the most distant points. For atoms of this description, out of which a world might arise, or from which it might be composed, have not been used up either on one world or on a limited number of worlds, whether resembling ours or not. Hence, nothing stands in the way of an unlimited number of worlds. This is classic Epicurean epistemology. Epicurus had this set of ideas about how we can know things, what we can know, and it was all in the service of being untroubled, that we shouldn't bother ourselves about things we can never answer, never know. And I want to, again, as always, I don't want to be unfair to Epicurus here. He had, in fact, I would say, a sort of self-contained philosophy, and some of what he was saying must have looked particularly promising or plausible to him in light of a world that was kind of fragmenting, right? Remember that the Hellenistic era was a period when what had seemed stable, cities and powers that had seemed stable were being conquered, were falling apart and splitting apart. And perhaps in that context, you might well surmise that the most plausible thing is that if we start from certain governing assumptions, if we begin with basic rules like atoms bouncing off of each other, these basic behaviors, we should only assent to, we should only believe in what we can extrapolate out from them, and if there's nothing to contradict our ideas, then we should just let them exist in our mind. And so multiple worlds is kind of like that. He's saying there's nothing to stand in our way of believing that atoms bouncing off one another infinitely through the void will ultimately produce worlds that some of them are like ours, some of them are unlike ours. Some of them might behave according to our rules, some of them might behave somewhat differently, right? Now, of course, it's not phrased in terms of things like multiple dimensions or string theory or inflationary cosmology, none of that. But the basic principle is the same, and it's there for the same reasons. It's there to defend the idea of an atomistic materialist universe. It's there to say if we begin from that premise, then we can essentially sort of extrapolate out into multiple universes, multiple worlds. The implications of this are profound, and they, again, mirror exactly what our modern physicists, our modern philosophers want to say about the multiverse. So I'm going to read to you now one of the great explainers of Epicurean philosophy, a guy called Lucretius. As Adams mentioned, remember, there were a lot of Romans that liked Stoicism, and there were also some Romans that liked Epicureanism. And so Lucretius was the guy that sort of explained the principles of Epicurus, the ideas of Epicurus, in poetic form. And of course, in the process of doing that, he creates all sorts of questions and contradictions, things that he says that Epicurus doesn't seem to say, some things that are in Lucretius that are not in Epicurus. But here he usefully, I think, expands for us on this idea of multiple worlds, what it means and what it's there to do. Why do we believe in this? Well, because then we can believe, for example, in the non-intervention of gods. Here's a portion from Book 2 of De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, by Lucretius. I'm reading here from this edition by Martin Ferguson Smith, his translation and notes on Lucretius. In the first place, he says, we have a universe without any limit anywhere in any direction, whether to left or right, upward or downward. I have demonstrated this, and indeed the fact is self-evident, for the nature of the unfathomable abyss is conspicuously clear. Now, since the extent of space is infinite in every direction, and in the unfathomable universe seeds numberless in number, harried by incessant movement, fly about in many ways, under no circumstances must it be considered likely that this one earth and heaven alone has been formed, and that all those particles of matter outside it achieve nothing, and all the more so, since our world is the creation of nature. The atoms themselves collided spontaneously and fortuitously, clashing together blindly, unsuccessfully, and ineffectually in a multitude of ways, until at last those atoms coalesced which, when suddenly dashed together, could always form the foundations of mighty fabrics, of earth, sea, and sky, and the family of living creatures. So I insist that you must acknowledge the existence elsewhere of other aggregations of matter, similar to this world of ours, which the ether hugs in a greedy embrace. You love the poetic turns in Lucretius, but note what he's saying, right? He's saying, if we start from the assumption that our world could have simply been created by random collisions of atoms, by random chance, then there's nothing remarkable about the fact that it operates according to a certain order, because eventually, given an infinite number of atoms in an infinite void, you're going to get all kinds of different things, including a universe like ours, a world like ours, where things make sense. But that doesn't mean that there can't be other stuff also out there in the random ether, where different rules apply. Moreover, writes Lucretius, when an abundant supply of matter is available, when space is at hand and there is no obstruction from any object or force, things most certainly must happen, and objects must be created. And if the fund of seeds is so vast that the sum of the lives of all living creatures would not suffice to count it, if the same force of nature is still operative and possesses the power to assemble all the seeds of things in the same order in which they have been assembled in our world, you are bound to admit that in other parts of the universe there are other worlds inhabited by many different peoples and species of wild beasts. Again, there's nothing prohibiting this from being the case in a purely logical, abstract sense. It's just an article of faith. It's an article of faith that the void is infinite, that the atoms are bouncing randomly through it, and that that's what caused the creation of our world. And in order to basically explain away the fact that our world is more ordered and more naturally coherent than we would expect in just a random concatenation of atoms, we have to posit that that's just what atoms are out there doing forever and ever, and we happen to live on the lucky rock where this stuff is going according to plans that we like, right? But there are other plans out there. In fact, none of it is really a plan. It's all just random atoms. And that's the next thing that he goes on to say. Nature is free from the intervention of the divine mind. He says, there is further consideration that in the totality of created things, there is nothing solitary, nothing that is born unique and grows unique and singular. Everything belongs to some family, and each species has very many members. To begin with, direct your attention to living creatures. You will find that this is true of the race of mountain-prowling wild beasts, the double breed of human beings, the dumb shoals of squamous fish, and all creatures that fly. Therefore, in accordance with the same principle, you must admit the sky and the earth and the sun, the moon, the sea, and the rest are not unique, but rather of numberless number. The fact is that they are restricted by the deeply driven boundary stone of life and are composed of substance subject to birth no less than every class of terrestrial things that comprises very many members. Once you obtain a firm grasp of these facts, you see that nature is her own mistress and is exempt from the oppression of arrogant despots, accomplishing everything by herself spontaneously and independently and free from the jurisdiction of the gods. For, and here I call to witness the sacred, peacefully tranquil minds of the gods who pass placid days and a life of calm, who has the power to rule the entirety of the immeasurable, Who has the power to hold in his hand the strong reins needed to govern the unfathomable? Who has the power to revolve all the skies together and fumigate with ethereal fires all the fertile earths? Who has the power to be in every place at every time, so as to form darkness with the clouds and to shake the serene tracts of the sky with thunder, and then to launch bolts, often demolishing his own temples, or retiring to the deserts for furious practice with the missile that often passes by the guilty and destroys the unoffending and the undeserving? Lucretius is saying, if there were a God, he would be unconscionably powerful, and he would be doing things that don't make any sense, that look unjust to us. That is, if there were a God that were intervening in human affairs. He says there might be gods somewhere else off there. Nothing prohibits us from believing that, but they don't involve themselves in our lives. Nature is free. Nature behaves according to rules all her own, and that's sufficient to explain absolutely everything that there is. Now, what's interesting to me about this is it actually has the same problem that even modern multiverse theories have if you accept them. Let's say that it's true. I mean, it's sort of a random set of ideas, but let's say that it's true that there are bubble universes, many different universes which bubble up, and this just happens to be the one where things behave in an orderly way that produces life, right? Let's imagine that's true. You're still positing a set of rules, right? You're positing a set of rules according to which these universes expand, this kind of universe-producing machine, as Meyer calls it. But who invented the rules, right? Where did the rules come from? This was a funny thing that Stephen Hawking, a brilliant physicist, right, wrote at one point in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was. He wrote, well, the universe can just come into being according to certain laws of physics. The laws of physics themselves create the universe. To which Roger Scruton, the great aestheticist and philosopher, replied, but who wrote the rules, right? So there is this still, it sort of pushes this question further away in order to avoid the obvious evidence in front of our eyes that the one mind which created all things created things according to a logic and with a purpose. It's not a proof, right? Because it's no more a proof than the multiverse is proven, right? None of these things is proven in the sense of like a mathematical equation that's going to prove this is true. But both of these possibilities are equally possible and involve leaps of faith. What I'm arguing is that the multiverse involves as many, many leaps of faith, which are actually quite crazy when you think about it and don't even answer the question, right? Going to get to how the evidence of the multiverse continues to break down in just a second, but I want to point out one other thing that Lucretius gets out of multiple worlds, because it's also relevant for our modern debates. This is book 5. Lucretius is asking here what causes the motion of the heavenly bodies, what causes the planets to move around, right? And he offers multiple different explanations for why this might be so. And then he says, which of these causes operates in our world? It is difficult to determine with certainty. I am teaching what can and does happen throughout the universe, in the various worlds, variously formed, and I am striving to set out several causes that may account for the motions of stars throughout the universe as a whole. One of these causes must impart motion to the heavenly bodies in our world, but to assert dogmatically which of them it is certainly does not befit one proceeding with cautious steps. Proceeding with cautious steps, not to disturb one's own tranquility, right? Not to believe anything that is not certainly proven. This is called the principle of plenitude. It's the idea that you can posit a bunch of different explanations for something, and if all of them are not contradicted, right? If none of them has anything to bar them, then each one of them might be true in some world, and we don't know which one is true in our world, but it doesn't really matter, right? This is exactly what modern physicists also get out of the multiverse, right? They get this idea that, well, you know, if we can imagine that there would be a God that caused this universe, we can equally well imagine that there are all sorts of universes in which all sorts of explanations apply and obtain. This principle of plenitude allows you basically to not settle on any one answer for anything, except the idea itself of the multiverse, which again is a set of assumptions, right? I mean, I really think that in the end, this thing defeats itself because you end up believing all sorts of things that have no evidence, right? There's this idea that you can only accept the things for which your eyes have direct evidence, or for which you can, which you can logically imagine out, breaks down when you ask yourself, well, where does the multiverse itself come from, right? Even if there are multiple worlds, who determined the rules according to which they come into being? That's the first problem with all of this. Now I want to talk a little bit about the development of multiverse philosophy, not multiverse science, but multiverse philosophy in the modern era, and some of that stuff that John Adams was talking about in the world where we are all Epicureans. It is the new year, which means it's the perfect time to start building your massive financial empire with Truebill. I need all of my Young Heretics listeners to help me take over the world and create a vast emporium of jacked philosopher kings. In order to do that, you need to be saving money, which is what Truebill does. They will pour through your subscriptions. They will look through everything that you're subscribed to, and they'll find stuff you're not using. You'll be shocked at how much of this there is. I found a bunch of these when I used Truebill. On average, people save up to $720 a year. That is a hefty chunk of change. There's stories of people finding car insurance and Netflix, and there's all sorts of things that you might not realize. Like maybe you were sharing an account with your ex and now you don't use it, but he does, or whatever. There's so many different things that they can just nickel and dime you. They exist to do this, right? Corporations know that you're going to forget about your subscription. In order to take advantage of that, they just sucker you into these free trials. And then you end up just hemorrhaging money when you don't need to be. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at truebill.com/heretics. Save me a bundle. Go right now, truebill.com/heretics. You could save thousands a year when you go to truebill.com/heretics. Okay, so here's the payoff of all of this ancient philosophy for us, right? Remember I said we are all Epicureans, and this is one way in which this is profoundly true, and you can actually trace it back to a passage from our old buddy David Hume. We're revisiting a lot of old friends today, and a while back we talked about David Hume. I gave some arguments why I think Hume was wrong about a lot of stuff, and one chapter in which I found him particularly fascinating was the chapter in which he refutes the idea of a kind of all-provident God who guides our affairs and who has made the world for our benefit and to his glory and all of these things. And I mentioned then that one of the most fascinating things about this chapter, it's chapter 11 of the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, one of the most interesting things about it is that he puts this speech into the mouth of Epicurus. It's Epicurus defending himself against the Athenians. So let me remind you some of the arguments he makes in there. One of the crucial things he says is our world displays certain patterns, let's say, right? We have observed what looks to us like cause and effect, even though we don't know that there's anything magical called cause that inheres, right? We know that, we've seen a million times that when we hold a stone in the air, we let it go, falls to the ground. We have no way of knowing whether that will happen all the time, except that we've always seen it happen before. And so that experience is the only place where we derive this idea. Now he says, the order of the universe only goes so far. And in fact, there are lots of things, just like Lucretius said, right? Lots of things that don't look just, that don't make sense. And so why should we assume that the God who hypothetically made this universe is more ordered or more just than what we see in the world? It's actually pretty sly. Here's David Hume speaking as Epicurus. He says, allowing, therefore, the gods to be the authors of the existence or order of the universe, it follows that they possess that precise degree of power, intelligence, and benevolence which appears in their workmanship, but nothing farther can ever be proved, except we call in the assistance of exaggeration and flattery to supply the defects of argument and reasoning. So far as the traces of any attributes at present appear, so far may we conclude these attributes to exist. The supposition of farther attributes is mere hypothesis. You hear the echoes of Epicurus here, right? The idea that we can only infer from what we see in front of us, and we can only infer as much as what we see in front of us will tell us. The supposition of farther attributes is mere hypothesis, much more the supposition that in distant regions of space or periods of time there has been or will be a more magnificent display of these attributes, and a scheme of administration more suitable to such imaginary virtues. We can never be allowed to mount up from the universe the effect to Jupiter, the cause, and then descend downwards to infer any new effect from that cause, as if the present effects alone were not entirely worthy of the glorious attributes which we ascribe to that deity. The knowledge of the cause being derived solely from the effect, they must be exactly adjusted to each other, and the one can never refer to anything farther or be the foundation of any new inference and conclusion. He's saying, effectively, what we see in this world only tells us so much, and we cannot infer that the order in this world speaks to some higher order above and beyond us. Now, again, this is a fair thing to say, but it's an article of faith, right? It's declaring that it's possible that there may be a God who orders all things to our good. The evidence might point us in that direction, but it can only take us so far and no farther. And therefore, we should not, in fact, posit this, but should posit a kind of infinitude of multiple worlds and universes. All I'm suggesting is that that suggests a bias in the other direction, a theological bias toward chaos and toward multiplicity, rather than toward order. Never let anybody fool you into thinking, right, that it is more scientific to have a bias toward chaos than to have a bias toward order. It's perfectly all right for scientists, for materialists, let's say, and theologians to have a debate about whether it is more or less likely that God created the universe. But it's not fair for scientists to play the scientist card and say that because they observe a universe that behaves according to certain patterns, they can extrapolate out from that to a pattern of endless chaos, right? There is this bias away from positing God as if that were any more scientific than suggesting that a transcendent mind ordered the universe, which we see and observe according to the patterns that we now know, since Hume, we have discovered, right, are actually quite minutely tuned to support the existence of life. This suggests to me tinkering with the universe. And I am not, the only person who thinks this, and I should not lump all scientists in with people who think this either, because as I've already said, and as Meyer shows at some length, there are plenty of scientists, plenty of physicists who have agreed that, in fact, there's just too much evidence of tinkering not to at least accept that that's a possible explanation of what's going on, that there is some mind ordering things and even indeed ordering them to our benefit. But we are all Epicureans. And when I say that, what I mean, again, is that there is this kind of ambient philosophy in the air that causes inertia to exist, that even if you see arguments for the existence of God, even if you experience the intervention of God in your life, there's still this kind of reticence or this shame to just suggesting, well, maybe that's the explanation for all of this, right? Why is that? It's because we have this cloud of Epicurean assumptions, which are now actually quite outdated, especially given the discoveries that have been made in physics, and which therefore are holding us back from admitting the evidence of our own eyes, of plunking for the thing that seems apparent, and instead having this chaos bias, right? This bias toward unreason, toward multiple explanations, toward an infinite number of many different possibilities, none of which are fundamentally governed or ordered by any beneficent mind. This falls apart when you try to make art out of it, and I suggest that that is an argument against it in and of itself. Let me explain what I mean. All stories, as we learned from Aristotle, proceed according to certain rules of cause and effect. Certain types of people behave in certain types of ways. The result is certain emotional conflicts, certain drama, which has to resolve, and the consequences of that are ultimate, right? A fundamentally chaotic universe is a fundamentally nihilist universe in which those rules of coherence and cause and effect can only obtain in these little pockets, in bubbles, right? And once we pull back the camera, right, if indeed our final assessment of the universe is that it is an endlessly chaotic, endlessly infinite bubbling up of many, many different possibilities, most of which don't even support life, right, then at the end of the day, the stories that we tell in these little bubbles won't have any meaning because there has to be some camera lens. You have to pull the camera lens back at some point to the fundamental reality of what's going on. And even if you zoom in, right, on this little universe, you just tell this story that makes sense there. Once you zoom out, you've destroyed the meaning and the consequence and the emotional weight of what happens within this little pocket. We are seeing exactly this go on in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I want to say that it's not just the MCU that's doing this. They have done it, I think, most visibly and most successfully, but you could name a bunch of other shows, right? Star Trek, for example, which is sort of playing with multiverse ideas. What's interesting is that you can always tell a good story within a certain realm of the multiverse, right? And there's nothing to stop you from that. And indeed, plenty of individual Marvel movies are perfectly good. I really liked the latest Spider-Man. I thought it was pretty fun. But the minute you pull the camera back and say, okay, well, what's really going on at the macro level, right, is that this is just one bubble in an infinitely many different possibilities, different possible outcomes. And we can now ponder the question, what if in some other realm, right? Once you do that, you inherently have to destroy the logic of the story you just told. It has to then be consigned to the dustbin of history. And Spider-Man Cubed does this in a very subtle way. Other movies like The Eternals do it kind of clumsily, which is why that movie doesn't really work. Spider-Man basically locks you into this new universe where all the different bad guys from all the previous franchises come together and all three Spider-Men come together to fight them. But without really calling attention to it, doing that destroys all the other franchises because all of the villains from those franchises are basically plucked up from the moment right before they're about to get defeated or killed and reformed and presumably then sent back into their own timeline so that all the stories in the entire Spider-Man franchise that have been told up to that point now don't happen, don't mean anything, just a blip, actually weren't real, right? Or at least were only, one sort of alternate possibility of millions of other things that could have happened and existed. We all feel that this is destroying the emotional power of these movies. We felt it, I think, most profoundly, even if we wanted to deny it, we felt it, I think, most profoundly in the stretch between Avengers Infinity Wars and Avengers Endgame. There was this big, chaotic, colossal moment, right? This climactic moment at the end of Infinity Wars. It was memed a million times. We all saw it. We all talked about it. Thanos snaps his fingers, right? He's got the Infinity Stones. He snaps his fingers, and half the population of the Earth vanishes because of his grand Malthusian plan to keep all things in balance. It's very poignant and emotional because we see all these characters that we've come to know and love, Spider-Man, Tom Holland Spider-Man especially, right, evaporate into thin air. And we were all, in that moment, both sad to see our favorite characters go and kind of a little incredulous that they were really going to let them die. We fooled ourselves into caring about the death of those characters when we all sort of knew that there was going to be some time travel solution that brought them back to life. And indeed, that was the birth in a real way of the Marvel multiverse, because ever since then, all they've been able to do is just revamp and rehash and reimagine and retcon old stories so that the stories that happened before don't matter anymore. And our emotional investment in them is therefore revealed to be a kind of cheap trick. Emotional investment in narrative is a real experience. We all have it. Any story that you can tell like a cheap joke and people still can get kind of emotionally invested in it. But we care about that as art. We care about narrative as art because we believe that it shows to us some reality about the world, namely that cause and effect and events have consequences, have emotional weight. And when you live in a multiverse where you know that all consequences are ultimately going to be erased by the next story that is told so that the next sort of nostalgia porn can be reinvented, right? And so that you can see the old characters that you love, really all it is a kind of narrative pornography. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Pornography is imagery of sex, which gives you sexual arousal but disconnects it from all the emotional truth that sex is supposed to communicate and convey, right? All the connection, all the belonging, all the love. Pornography strips that away. It just gives you the stimulus. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, that is the multiverse, creates narrative pornography because you have all the emotions, or you have some of the emotions, sort of like a pale imitation of the emotions that real narrative is supposed to convey. But you know that it's not actually connected to any real fundamental cause or any depiction of the universe as it actually works in your life and in your experience. And it's all going to be erased the next time some studio exec wants to make another buck off of you. Go to the Marvel movies, I do too, but you are being had. You're being manipulated because the multiverse creates a situation in which the only rules about what can and can't happen are not the rules of physics as we know them, not the rules of emotional cause and effect, not the rules of love and meaning and truth, but just the rules of which studio exec wants to make money with which actor who can sign a gajillion-dollar contract today. Those are the only rules that govern the multiverse because they're the only rules that are actually real and actually obtain. And this suggests to me that the multiverse is a fundamentally nihilistic concept which produces fundamentally nihilist and utterly commercialist art. We all know that sometimes you watch a TV show and some character gets killed off and you realize that that means the character didn't renew his contract or whatever. We sort of shrug and suspend our disbelief. But what we have to understand is that in the MCU, in the multiverse, every decision is like that. Every narrative choice is made according to what is going to make them the most money by stimulating that little switch in your brain that goes off when you see a death or a love story or something, without any consequences in the actual depiction of the real world as it works. All they're doing is just turning switches on in your brain to make as much money off of you as they possibly can, because the multiverse, besides all of its many philosophical problems, has been, for the thousands of years that it's been around, a fundamentally nihilist concept. I hope those movies are all now completely ruined for you. You can address all complaints to my producer, Jonathan Hay, and I will talk to you more next week. 2022 is a great time to get your skincare game on point with disco. I think when guys hear the word skincare, they like freak out like you're going to be putting on makeup or something, but it's really not that. And, you know, everybody should care how they look. If you're trying to get a date, you're trying to get a job, whatever, I don't care. You don't need like acne or big bags under your eyes. Disco is a skincare brand that is designed specifically for men. So the problems that guys tend to get, dry skin, acne, razor burn, all of this stuff can be fixed with really simple products. They're a brand based in Austin, Texas. They're created specifically for male skin issues. I really like they have this stick that you can roll on under your eyes. If you get eye bags like me, I sort of don't sleep all that much. And so that's particularly useful for me, but they have a bunch of other stuff, exfoliants, moisturizers, like, you know, the cleanser for after you shave, all these things. If you want to check out Disco and try their incredible skincare products for yourself, we have a special offer for the Young Heretics audience. Go to www.letsdisco.com and enter Heretics at checkout for 30% off your first order. That's letsdisco.com with code Heretics for 30% off your first order. That's a great discount. So thank you, Disco. And go check it out. All mailbag questions come to me through Locals. Locals is an incredible platform. It's created by my buddy Dave Rubin, and he has taken it to grand new heights. But the fundamental concept is that nobody gets in the way of the relationship that we are building here on this show. Locals VIPs get all sorts of extra stuff. You get, episodes a week in advance. You get your questions answered in the mailbag. There are live stream Q&As. I do translations of the Bible. We pray together. Fundamentally, it's just a group of people that want to take the ideas in the show further and enrich their lives with them and talk about what they mean for us personally. We've got a bunch of new members now, a bunch of new VIPs, because over the holiday season, a bunch of people joined. So I'm really glad to see them. And I hope that you also will become one of us. Go to youngheretics.com/locals to sign up and get all that extra stuff. It's really, I think, a very reasonable price for the year for the annual membership, just $56. Youngheretics.com/locals. Okay, here's a mailbag question from Drew. I received the Talmud for Christmas. Wow, somebody loves you. I received the Talmud for Christmas. It's been on my book list for a while. I'm fascinated by the extra detail it presents for stories that may have only had 1 or 2 verses in the canonical Bible. The narrative seems to emphasize the interaction between the generations that, at least for me, got lost in the rote reading of the genealogies, i.e. Abraham lodging with Noah, Shem, going to Isaac's birthday celebration, etc. Do you have any words of wisdom or things you would recommend I keep in mind or look out for as I read? Okay, yes, awesome. I love that you're reading the Talmud. For those that don't know, the Talmud is a vast compilation of Jewish teaching and rabbinic literature, which contains the halacha. And the halacha is the law, the Jewish law, all the rules that they observe beyond the ones that are just in the Torah. And it's based on the Mishnah. So my first piece of advice for you is to know what you are reading. And this goes for anything that you pick up to read that isn't just a modern novel or whatever. Know where it comes from, know what the purpose of it is, know what you're supposed to be getting out of it. The Mishnah, which comes from a Hebrew word meaning like to study by repetition. Shana is to repeat, to revise over and over again, right? The Mishnah is a compilation sort of around the turn of the 3rd century AD. The teachings of the rabbinic sect called the Pharisees, the oral teachings, were set down into this book. Remember from some of our previous discussions that the Pharisees and the Sadducees who show up in the Gospels were actually 2 competing rival sects of clerics. And the Pharisees were the ones who believed in oral tradition, binding oral tradition, which is ultimately what the halakha is going to turn out to be, right? Binding oral tradition in addition to and over and above the Torah. You have what's called the written Torah and then the unwritten Torah, or these oral traditions about solving problems within the community, right? We all know that plenty of laws come up out of precedent. You look at some law in Florida and it's like nobody can tie a flamingo to a speedboat. I made that one up, but there are these crazy laws in the books in some places. And you think, well, something must have happened to make that a law, right? The Mishnah and then the Talmud is the record of that process over many centuries. It was finished in the 8th century AD. The Mishnah kind of preserves the Pharisaical tradition of teaching, and then the Talmud, which comes from the word lamad, meaning to teach, right? The Talmud is the teaching and the argument and the commentary on the Mishnah. So what you are reading when you read the Talmud is hundreds of years worth of inherited received wisdom and verdicts about specific juridical cases. And in order to do that, as you observe, they reach back into the Bible, into the Torah, and pick up these stories and imagine things that might have happened in between the verses. Maybe they carry forward some traditional stories that existed around the time of the composition, right? It's an oral tradition. So think of it the way you would think of any other oral tradition. Namely, some things are, maybe kind of urban legends. Some things are maybe, real cultural recollection. But all of it for observant Jews is binding. That is, it contains the received cultural wisdom of centuries of discussion and argument over how this text should operate in our lives. How should we follow rules that are, derivable from the Torah? And so I'm going to read to you one of the most famous Talmudic stories. One of them, the ones that really, I think, has stuck in people's heads because of what it says. About this whole process. And this is from Bava Metzia 59, I think it is. Yeah, 59b. If you want to read the Talmud, but somebody didn't get it for you for Christmas, then you should go to sefaria.org, sefaria.org. They've got a bunch of stuff. They've got the Mishnah, they've got the Talmud, they've got all sorts of awesome Jewish literature. Like many passages in the Talmud, this passage relates a dispute between two different rabbis. In this case, it's Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. And what they're arguing about is actually not all that important. All you need to know is that Rabbi Yehoshua has the majority, and Rabbi Eliezer is trying to plead his case. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, "If the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it." The walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls and said to them, "If Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halacha, what is the nature of your involvement in this dispute?" The Gemara relates, the walls did not fall because of the deference due to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten because of the deference due to Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning. So Eliezer and Yehoshua are in this fight. Eliezer says that the walls will fall if I'm right, and they start to fall, and then Yehoshua rebukes them, and they remain leaning. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, "If the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it." A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, "Why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halacha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion?" Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, "It is written, it is not in heaven." This is a quote from Deuteronomy, that the Torah is not in heaven, but on earth, so that you can consult it. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, "it is not in heaven" in this context? Rabbi Yirmeiah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline. Since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halacha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. The Gemara relates, years after Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, "What did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time?" When Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration, Elijah said to him, "The Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, 'My children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me.'" The reason this is so famous and so powerful, and I think helps to answer your question, is that it's incredibly profound, witty, self-aware, and mysterious, this idea that this written text and this tradition was what God wants us to have. And even if he is omniscient, he wants us to be arguing and figuring out these questions on the basis of, our centuries of received wisdom. And even if a divine voice comes down from heaven and reveals the truth, nevertheless, that is not the process that God wants us to be following. Very different from a lot of more evangelical traditions, right? This idea of direct communion with God. Here is this, it's kind of reminiscent also of the argument between God and Abraham, that even if you think God has an intended outcome, he invites Abraham into this dialogue and debate with him. Some of this stuff can be really shocking, I think, for Christians when we encounter it, because it represents different ways of engaging with the text. But it's enormously beautiful and valuable, I think. Even if you would never, I personally don't consider any of this binding on my life, but I find it fascinating. And what other culture has this detailed? Besides maybe the Romans at the height of their power had a legislative system that sort of mimicked this endless record of common law. But the Talmud is about everything, right? It's about how to wash your hands. It's about what to do in cases of adultery. It's about, what God thinks about Scripture. And it's this enormous sort of wealth that you can just dip into at will. And that's where the detail about the stories comes from. It comes from this oral tradition of talking about and imagining what these stories, getting imaginatively into the stories. And it can help Christians, I think, in that way, to think about these stories as real narratives that have human detail in them that's left out, that you can imagine, right? Anyway, it's a great journey. I hope you enjoy it and report back on it. But that's my advice to you. Know what you're looking at. You are looking at commentary on the Mishnah, which is the Pharisaical tradition of oral teaching, to supplement the Torah, to supplement Scripture over many hundreds of years, which contains the wealth of inherited wisdom of a culture, of a people. That's it from me. If you like this show, as always, you should check out the Claremont Institute where I work. We put out 2 publications, both of which I highly endorse. One is the Claremont Review of Books. One is the American Mind. You can find them both online, and the Claremont Review of Books also has a Dead Tree version. I think some of the best writing out there is on the American Mind and at CRB. And I'm not just saying that because they publish me. They also publish lots of other people who are smarter than me. We could use your help and your donations. Go to claremont.org/donate. And if you do, then let us know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics, because that always makes my heart sing. All right, folks, it's a pleasure to be with you as always. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.